You know, we're approaching July, and for most of us, as you know, we do a block party in July. And normally the block party, what it is we go into the streets and we do a 2-day event where we're just talking about God and really just pushing out the love of Jesus and really showing it through how we're doing it and through our words. And Psalms chapter 3. And usually around this time, the Lord starts putting things in my heart about war and things like that. And for some reason, it just so happened, you know, we're coming into July 4th, you know, the celebration of our independence and things of that sort. And it's interesting because I never really connected everything together, you know, knowing July 4th, block party, freedom, salvation. And it hit me this year more than ever that, you know, God really wants to go into these places and set you free. You guys hear an echo, right? You know, God really wants to go into these places and set people free. And it has to be by His power, His will, His ability, His supernaturalness. And one of the things, if you know about the 4th of July, we're celebrating it. And you know, July 4th is not actually the day we complete. That's when we declared independence. You know, and we were going into a war. But if you know of any type of war, this war was fought in our homeland. It was fought here. It's not like all the other wars we have fought where they have been overseas, far away, so you're at your houses. This one and the Civil War were fought in our home ground. And a lot of times in the spiritual world, we tend to forget that the spiritual war is fought at home, in our places, where you're at. This spiritual warfare is not happening in some heavens where you're not seeing it. This spiritual warfare is not happening somewhere far away and you're not touched by it. This spiritual warfare happens right there in your front yard, your backyard, in your room, when you're by yourself. And it's one of the hardest things to go through. And as Christians, guess what? As we've always called ourselves a frontline ministry. You know, I was talking to some friends yesterday and we were talking about ministries. I said, we're not a castle ministry. There's ministries that they stay behind the castle and they work with the people in the castle. No, we're the dog down, dirty fighters. They threw us outside. They threw us outside of the castle. And we're out there in the front. And when you do that, guess what? You have a big bullseye on you. Big bullseye on you. And why am I talking about this? Because this is one of the times when Christians, especially at our church, you're going to get hit. You're going to be attacked. And a lot of times we hear a lot of voices and it's easy for us to listen to that voice and saying, this is not what I pictured Christianity to be. This is not what I thought it was going to be. And I want to look at Psalms chapter 3. David wrote this. And as he wrote this, you have to understand David's mindset. He was just leaving Jerusalem, the place he had built, because his son had come in and said, now I will be king. And David had the ability to fight right there and then. But David said, you know what? I don't want the people here to be hurt, so I'm walking out. And David, as he's walking out from his own son who he had given grace to, he's walking out and he's leaving. He's leaving his place. And he writes this Psalms here. And as we read through it, you'll see his mindset. It says, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there will be which say of my soul, there is no hope for him, no help for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of my head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. I lay me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000 people that have set themselves against me around about. Arise, O Lord, save me. O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. But look at the beginning. David comes in and he says, Lord, how the troubles around me have increased. All David saw was pain around him. See, he's leaving this place and his son has just, again, his son pretty much kicked him out. And he heads out. And this is the son he helped. He forgave him. He said, you know what? You messed up big, but I forgive you and I bring you back in. And he kicks him out. And as he's walking out, you have to understand his mindset here. He thinks God has forgotten about him. He thinks God has left him. He says, Lord, how can all these people rise up against me? And he's walking out in despair. And his mindset somewhere there, he comes to a point where he thinks that he has failed God. And as most of you know, if you know the story of David, David was blessed. God loved him. God called him a man after his own heart. God hadn't left him yet. The seed of Jesus was still going to come from him. The blessing that Abraham had promised, that God promised Abraham, it was still coming from him. It hadn't left him. But at this moment, all he saw was his past failures. And in this moment, all he felt was his weaknesses. And a lot of times we get that way. We're going strong for God, and then all of a sudden something happens. And normally it's when you help someone and that person, we're expecting a thank you or gratefulness, and they turn around and they kick you in the butt, and all of a sudden, why am I doing what I'm doing? You're praying for this family member, you're helping this family member, and all of a sudden they did you wrong. And you quickly start looking at all your past failures and say, there's no way God could have been in the mix of this. There's no way God could have been helped me in this. And all of a sudden, your past failures come up and your current weaknesses put you in a point where in your heart, a little bit of disbelief begins to grow. And it's one of the worst things that can happen, because when the voice of the heart begins to start coming with disbelief, it's when the mind begins to think, is there really God there in the mix of everything? Is there really God there helping me through this situation? If God is so good, why is it so bad right now? If God is so good, why am I going through all these problems? Why am I going through all this trouble? They said he's a good God. That guy even tells me that I'm supposed to shake someone's hand and tell him I am blessed, but I don't feel so blessed right now. I don't feel godly. I don't feel righteous. I don't feel like a man of God. And you go through these things, and when those voices start coming out of your own heart, it's the scariest part. Because when it starts coming out of their own heart, it's easy for the heart to turn away from the one that truly loves them. And Paul talks about this. You don't have to go there. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5, Paul says, for when we were come into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest. So Paul had been traveling. There was no rest for him. He was constantly being chased and beaten. But we were troubled on every side. So trouble's coming up from everywhere he's at without ever fighting. Within were fears. He says within were fears that were growing. See, Paul had served God mightily. He had followed God and done what God had asked him to do. And all of a sudden, trouble starts rising up. You ever notice that when you feel like you're having your perfect walk with God, all of a sudden everything's falling in place? You're reading your Bible, you're praying, you're singing songs. You even walk around and you're talking to those people you normally don't want to talk to. Or is that just me? Or is But you're going around and you feel like you're walking on cloud 9. And all of a sudden, the trouble starts coming up. And you start wondering, where is this all coming from? I'm doing what you want me to do, God. And Paul was doing this, and he said, trouble rose up all around me. And he said, even when I wasn't even trying to fight, things were coming up. And he said, but the worst part of it was the end. Within me, a fear arose. See, Paul understood that when that fear inside starts arising, it begins to take control of our mind. It begins to take control of our life. And when fear is arise in you, doubt begins to arise, and all of a sudden, you forget that you serve a mighty God. You forget that you serve a God who brought you out of darkness, a God who brought you out of despair, a God who brought you out of hopelessness. And David was going through this. David felt like he was losing everything. He felt like everything around him was falling apart. It says, even as he walked out of Jerusalem, there was a crippled man up there who used to be a relative of the old king. And he began to curse at David, saying, see, this is what you get. God was never with you. And you know what David did? His men wanted to attack this man. And David said, leave him alone. He said, maybe God will have pity on us because of all his curses. That's how low he felt. He said, you know what? I need God to have pity on me. Maybe this man cursing me will help me have favor in God's eyes again. And sometimes we get to that point where we're walking with God and we're trying to do the right thing and everything's falling apart around us. And we feel like God has forgotten us and we feel like he has left us off. The psalmist in chapter 77, he talks about the same struggle. And this ain't David that wrote it. But he says, I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with my own heart and my spirit make diligent search. So he's saying that from his own heart, this cry's coming out. He says, will the Lord cast off forever? In other words, will the Lord forget me forever? You see, sometimes we get to a point where we think God has forgotten about us. And that's mistake number one. God will never leave you. God will never leave you. But here in this darkness, in this despair, this depression that the psalmist was going through, he says, will the Lord cast me off forever? The Lord had not cast him off. I've come to understand that in your struggles and your darkest moment, guess what? God is closest to you at that moment. He says, and will he be favorable no more? Will God no longer have favor on my life? God always has favor on your life. The favor may not be the way you think it should be. That doesn't mean money's going to fall from the skies and everything happens perfectly. The favor around you is that, you know what? Though you're going through the same struggle that other person's going through, there's a protection around you. You don't see it at the time because you're going through the same pain, but it could be worse. And God is there and his favor is around you and he's guiding you and he's protecting you. And he's directing you that way. Well, the Lord, is his mercy clean gone from me? Well, is his mercy gone forever? Is his promises failed forevermore? This man felt like God had completely left him. He was hearing these voices. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has his anger shut up his tender mercy? He felt like all alone. This man just felt like everything has left. And let me tell you, these are the battles that saints go through constantly. It's these voices in our heads. It's these voices in our hearts that begin to rise up and says, have we failed God so much that he can't use me again? Have we gone so far away that God cannot reach and grab us once again? Have I not followed hard enough? Have I not worked hard enough? Have I not prayed hard enough? Have I not sing hard enough that God has forgotten about me? And we all go through these struggles. We don't say it. We come in with a smile on our face and say, how are you, brother? How art thou? God bless you. Hallelujah. And we jump and sing. But a lot of us know when you're going back home, you're going through this struggle and saying, why am I having the life I'm having? Am I not supposed to be in victory? Am I not supposed to be constantly in praise? I failed God. Some of us condemn ourselves so much that we wake up in the morning and you're already condemned. You wake up in the morning, you said, oh, I didn't pray. Messed up number one. Oh, I didn't read my Bible. Mess up number two. Oh, I was thinking about something. Mess up number three. And all you're doing is condemning yourself throughout the day. And you're walking through defeat constantly. And these voices start coming up and they begin to tell you, see, you weren't good enough. I told you you were going to fail him. I told you you were going to mess up. I told you you weren't going to make it. And there comes a point where as Christians, as people, you have to come to a point and say, what voice will I listen to? Because those condemning voices never leave. You see, the moment you became a Christian, guess what happened? The devil put a bullseye on you. And he said, I had you, now I want you back. And that condemning voice will consistently be there, beating at you, sometimes louder, sometimes lower. And sometimes it comes in so sweet. It comes in so sweet. Wasn't it easier when you didn't have to listen to this God? Weren't you more blessed when you didn't give over everything? Didn't it seem like life just flowed better for you? And this condemning voice comes consistently throughout life. And as saints, this is a constant war that we're in, and it's a war that will never end until Jesus comes back. In John chapter 12, you don't have to go there. There's a story, and if you know the story of Lazarus, Lazarus had passed away, and Jesus comes and he raises him up from the dead. And in chapter 12, if you read about it, it doesn't tell the whole story of Lazarus there. What it tells is that when Lazarus came back to life, as Lazarus was sitting there with Jesus, guess what? It says people from all over came to see, not just Jesus, but they came to see Lazarus. They wanted to see this living dead man. This man who had been dead for 4 days. And Jesus came and called them out, and they wanted to see this man. And if you read in there, it even talks about that the Pharisees had gathered, and they began to plot. They wanted to kill Lazarus. Can you imagine that? You just rose again from the dead. You're a walking miracle of God, and people want to kill you? They want to kill him. And here Lazarus is, and they're all coming in to see him. He became a living testimony. And it just says that many came to believe in Jesus because of Lazarus. Now, it doesn't go into the story, but I can only imagine how that story went. Lazarus is sitting at this table, and these people are coming and visiting him, and they're asking him, what was going on? What did you feel? What was going on in all that time? And I picture his story going this way. So if you go back to the word and it doesn't say it exactly like I'm saying, remember, I'm saying this is the way I picture the story going. I picture Lazarus sitting there, and he's telling them, I was lying in my bed near death. And everyone around me, I could hear these voices. There's not much time. There's not much time for him. He's headed to death, but we've called Jesus. We've called Jesus, so he should be on his way. But it's not looking good for him. It's not looking good. I can only imagine that there was a voice of hopelessness there. You know when you see someone and that's it for them. And you can't hide it in your voice. And I can only imagine his family around him telling him, you're going to be all right. But in their voices, he could hear the hopelessness. And even the voices around him, not the audible, but the ones inside saying, it's hopeless for you, Lazarus. You love Jesus, but you're going to die. And I can only imagine that he started to say, and then as the lights began to get dimmer, and then he feels death approaching, he can hear the voices saying, Jesus hasn't shown up yet. We've called him and he's not here yet. Jesus is not here. And I can only imagine the other voices in his head beginning to tell him, see, you followed this man that said he was a son of God. You saw him do miracles. He called you friend. But now you need him. And where is he? He's nowhere near. He's nowhere close by. You're in a hopeless situation. You're all by yourself. And I can only imagine the voice inside of him begin to rise as he feels life slipping away. And he's sitting there, and every part of him is hoping that Jesus would show up. And as little and little as life is slipping away from him, I can only imagine it's that voice that we get in our last desperation, that little voice in there that says, God, if you can do anything, just do it, please. I don't know how, I don't know where. God, if you could do anything, just do it. And I can imagine that he probably whispered that with his last breath. God, if you can do anything, just do it. I'm not ready to go. I'm not ready to die. And I can only imagine in his darkness as he begins to tell him this. And he says, I can only imagine in complete darkness there, now dead. Soul still alive, but now dead. Only imagine the voices that were taunting him. Where was your Jesus at? Where was your God at? They were always there. He was there to feed 5,000, but he couldn't come save his best friend. He couldn't come save his friend. Where was he? But see, that wasn't the end of Lazarus' testimony. And I can only imagine as those people sat around there in despair, I can only imagine what Lazarus said next. But then in my darkness, in my hopelessness, in my death, I heard a voice. I heard a voice like no other. I heard a voice come through and it sounded familiar. It sounded like a voice I've heard before, but not with that same power. Not with the power that I was hearing now. I heard this voice and all it simply did was call my name. All it did. And in that voice I heard a power. The same power that I believe grabbed the earth and began to form it. The same voice that had power that said, the seas will separate from here to there. The same voice that said, let there be light and let there be darkness. There was a power in this voice I heard in there, and all it said was Lazarus. And I knew it, and it gripped me. It gripped me. It gripped me like no other. And it said, Lazarus, come forth. And I can only imagine Lazarus telling his testimony that right here, in that moment, he heard a voice of such power. A voice that spoke into the hopelessness and spoke hope back in. A voice that spoke into death and brought life back in. A voice that spoke into all the other voices and drowned them all out. The other voices that had said, Jesus forgot about you. Jesus had failed you. He didn't follow through on none of his promises. That voice overpowered all of them and said, Lazarus, I still love you. I haven't forgotten about you. I'm still there. And David was in that same situation. If you look at the chapter 3, it says in verse 4 and 5, I cried out to the Lord. In verse 5, he said, I laid down and slept. And a lot of us were laying down and we're sleeping. We've gone through so much struggle. You've been beat up. You've been hurt. And you're in pain. And you've laid down. You've done your last cry. God, if you can do anything, just help me. Some of you went to bed last night crying. Crying over things. You've been praying for things. You've been begging God for things. And He hasn't answered. And you've been going through struggles. And you just said, all I can do is sleep. And sometimes you just want to sleep. You don't want to get up. Because when you wake up, you know the reality of the world is there. But in your sleep, it can be whatever you want. But David said, I laid down and I slept. And he says, and He awoke me. And He sustained me. If you listen to that word awoke, if you look at the Greek version, it says it gripped. It's a gripping. It's a sudden awakening. It's something that you're not expecting. And that's the thing, right in your darkness, when you feel like giving up and everything else has gone out, that's when God's voice speaks the loudest. And all it's simply doing is calling your name. And it awakes you. And it wakes you and it grips you. It grips you in a way you never expected to be gripped in. You didn't expect God to grab you right there and then. In your darkest moment when you felt like a failure, when you felt like everything had fallen apart and you felt like a loser and you felt like life was done with, that's when Jesus speaks and it grips you and it grabs you, and it's the power of that voice that overpowers everything else. It's the power of that voice that goes in and it speaks directly to your soul. Everyone else has given up on you. Everyone else has said there's no hope for you. But that voice still finds hope once again. That voice still goes down deep and it finds it once again. And it sustains you. That voice doesn't just tell you, calls your name. What does it do? It tells you, come forth. It awakes you and it sustains you. You see, you're going to go through these battles. Those voices are going to come. But you always have to understand that there's a voice that is way powerful than all those other voices. There is a voice that is way stronger that tells you you're a child of God. There's a voice that comes up and it says, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. You see, it's a voice that says, my saints can walk through serpents. And even if they're bitten, nothing happens to them. And that doesn't mean physical serpents. That means through this life, let me tell you, there's snakes everywhere. There's snakes at home, there's snakes at work, and they bite you. And they sometimes put a little poison in you. But if you know that voice that tells you no weapon formed against you shall prosper, you can trample through snakes and nothing happens. It tells you that even if you're bitten and that poison begins to come, guess what? The voice of power has said it's not going to affect you. It has no way to come here. It has no way to have control over you. And that's why David at the end of it said, though 10,000 men rise up against me, you have slapped them all on the cheek. He said, you just backhand them. Can you imagine just a backhand? God backhands all your troubles. You know who gets backhanded? People that don't even get respect. And you know this is back in the olden time. This ain't new. And the psalmist David was saying, God, you don't even have enough respect for the things that have risen against me that you backhand them. You backhand them. You smite them against their cheek. You smite them against their cheek. And that didn't mean that problems aren't going to arise. They're going to arise. But guess what? God has already prepared the victory for you. God has already been there preparing something. And I know it's a struggle. There's times at nights you sit at your bed and you wonder why God called you. You wonder why you ended up in a church. You wonder why someone told you about Jesus. Because you feel like the biggest loser. I'll be the first one to admit I do that on a constant basis. I sat there last night saying, Lord, how can I go preach on something? How can I go do this? But there's always that voice inside of you that says it's not because of you. It's because of the one that's greater in you. You see? And God is that voice. He's the one that wakes us up. He wakes us up in our depression. He wakes us up in our hurt and our pain. He hasn't given up on you. You haven't failed enough that God has forgotten about you. And that's what the devil wants you to think. He wants you to finally to agree with that voice that says God is no longer with you. Because he knows once you believe in that voice, guess what? Everything else is easy to do. You think he draws you back with your temptations? No, those are an aftermath. The first thing he wants you to think is that God no longer loves you. That God can no longer do something for you. Because the moment you agree with that statement, everything else is easier to do. Everything's easy to do. Because you think that there's no relationship with you and God. And if he can make you believe that, he's won. And that's why that voice that Jesus places inside of us is so strong. And he says, my love endures forever. My promise is that I'm not going to leave them from you. My love endures forever. That voice goes inside and says, stop feeling rejected because I took your rejection. Feel accepted. I went to that cross to be rejected so you could be accepted by God. That same voice goes inside and tells you, stop feeling ashamed because I took on your shame. When I went to that cross, I took on that shame so that you could have my righteousness. You see? And that voice will arise if you allow it to. But there always comes a point you have to decide, what voice will you listen to? Will you continue to listen to that voice that points out your failures? That points out how many times you've fallen down? How many times you've failed God? How many times you failed your family? How many times you've said angry things and you've become bitter and hatred inside of you? Or you listen to that voice that just simply calls your name. Simply calls your name, not in anger. That's one of the worst things. We think of God as an angry God. And we hear him calling our name like our parents called our names when they were angry. You know, most of you probably know this, but my real name's Antonio. You know why I don't go by Antonio? Because it reminds me of every time my parents called me when they were upset. That's why I tell them, call me Tony. Don't call me Antonio, because that's what it reminds me. It triggers a little, you'll see my eye twitch a little bit. And a lot of us, we picture God that way. That when God calls our name, he's calling it out of anger. And we forget that God calls our name as a lover. There's that sweet way that your wife or your husband calls your name, and you know it as soon as you hear it on the phone. You know who you're talking. You know which person you're talking to when you answer that phone. You know real quickly if you need to hang up and act like you're going through a tunnel or something. And you call, oh, that's not the wife I want to talk to. No. Oh, yeah, that's the one. You know exactly when they say your name. And that's the way we picture God sometimes. We don't realize that every time God's calling your name, He's calling it out of love. He never calls your name out of anger. That's not who He is. He calls it out of love. And every time you're ready to fall asleep and you whisper, Lord, all I want to do is sleep. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of the way my life is. And the thing that we miss, we hold ourselves to such high standards and we say, no one else felt like this. If you read throughout the Bible, every saint in there went through this. Elijah went through a depression. He had so many victories. He won a great victory of God. He said, put your bull, I'll put my bull. We'll both call on our gods and we'll see who wins. And he killed thousands of men in that. And he won a great victory for God. Then all of a sudden a voice came and told him, by the end of the day, I'm going to have your head. And you know what he did? He went and he ran. And he laid down and he said, Lord, just take me. I'm ready to die. Just take me. And all he did was whisper, Lord, just take me. And you know what God did? God didn't say, Elijah, you big old failure, come here. What's wrong with you? God said, go to that mountain and I'm going to talk to you. And he was waiting for him to come in fire. He was waiting for him to come in earthquakes. And it came in a gentle whisper. Now I believe that gentle whisper just said his name, Elijah. I still love you. Elijah, I haven't left you. Wake up. Wake up. I'm still here. And a lot of times we go into that. And I know you fall into that depression and you fall into that place because your life is just not turning out the way you thought it should turn out. And God is there and He's telling you, wake up. Don't sleep no more. Wake up. And He's whispering your name and He's saying, come forth. Come forth. Guess what? Lazarus woke up out of his death. And if you read chapter 12, it says he began to bring people to Jesus. God wants to use the voice inside of you to bring others to Jesus. It's not a scripture. It's not always going to be a scripture or a preaching that does it. It's the voice inside of you that says, I was once dead, but now alive. I was once asleep, but now I'm awake and sustained. It's a voice. It's a voice that can only come out of you. It's a voice of glory. David said in chapter 3 in the Psalms, he says, your glory was put inside of me and you lifted my head. When that voice speaks, it puts a piece of glory inside of you. You see, when that voice spoke into Lazarus, it put a piece of glory inside of God. It put a piece of God's glory inside of him. And that's why he sat at that table and those people began to come to Jesus. And when that voice whispers your name and you listen to it and you come forth, guess what? It puts a little bit of God's glory inside of you. And you're not going on your own righteousness. You're going on God's glory. And He lifts your head. Many of you walked around in life so long with your head down because you have been beaten up by so many people. And the worst person that beat you up was yourself. And you walked with your head down. I'm a failure as a mother. I'm a failure as a daughter. I'm a failure as a son. I'm a failure as a husband. I'm a failure as a person. And you walked with your head down. And David said, He woke me up and He sustained me. And He put some glory into me. And not just that, guess what? He said, lift your head. Because you're a child of God now. You're not defeated. You're not defeated. You're not beat up. Yeah, you're going to have hard times. But you lift your head up. Not because of your own will. Not because I am who I am because of me. I am who I am because of God. And He lifts your head up because you're a child of God. And He's the only one that can lift you out of that type of darkness. He's the only voice that can speak into hopelessness and speak hope once again. He's the only voice that can speak into darkness and bring light again. But you have to be willing to listen to it. You have to be willing to answer it. He said, Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus could have laid there, but it drowned out every voice. It drowned out every other voice that was there. And he walked through. And God's telling you the same thing today. He's calling your name. What are you going to do about it? He's calling your name. He knows what you've been going through. He knows the heartache you have felt. He knows the depression you've gone through. He knows the pain you've gone through. No one else knows, because we're tough people sometimes. We want to hide it all in. We don't want anyone to know that we're struggling. You walk to work and they tell you, how's it going? You say it's going good. But inside you're a living hell. Inside everything's falling apart. And God knows what you're going through. And He's calling your voice. His voice is calling you once again. And He's just whispering your name. And you have to decide, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? Are you going to listen and walk forward? Or are you going to continue to sleep? You can continue to sleep, and let me tell you, life will pass you by. You'll think you're enjoying life. You'll think you'll have times where it's a nice dream. You'll have nice dreams. But you'll never really live life unless you hear that voice and come forth. You'll never start living life the way it's supposed to be lived unless God is doing something in your life. All you're doing is surviving. When you sleep through life, all you're doing is surviving. Living life is waking up and being sustained by God. Living life is waking up and following after Him. That's life. It has its ups and downs, its twists and turns. But you know you have a partner right beside you who's going through it all the way. He's taken this ride so many times that He knows. Be ready. Here it comes. Watch out right there. That's going to hit you. Don't worry. You may knock down a little bit, but I'm going to pick you back up. You're going to get through this together. But you have to listen to that voice. Right there where you're at. I'm just going to ask that you just close your eyes for a moment. Just bow your heads. Allow the Holy Spirit to deal with you.